The Barbara Bush Houston Literacy Foundation proudly presents a celebration of reading, made possible through the generosity of KPRC2, Phillips 66, and our many local supporters.
Brad Taylor is the New York Times bestselling author of the Pike Logan series. It's comprised of 18 books. He grew up in rural Texas and retired from the U.S. Army Infantry and Special Forces as a lieutenant colonel after 21 years of service.
Pierce Bush caught up with Brad Taylor for more insight on how his background influences his work as an author.
We're here with Greater Houston native Brad Taylor, graduate of Conroe High School. We're so honored to have you here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
Great
you.
to be back. Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about your most recent book.
Sure.
Dead Man's Hand, 18th book in the series involving Pike Logan, this time hand-to-hand combat with some of Vladimir Putin's henchmen. What kind of research goes into a book like this?
Yeah, so this book is actually unique, and I don't ordinarily write about current events because they're current, and anything could happen in writing the book that just make it dead in the water. So, I mean, the flash to bang on a book publication is about a year. So if you're writing about current events, you better be spot on when it's done or you're in trouble. And I was doing research on Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, not because I was writing a novel, just because I still keep on top of all that. And one of the questions always everybody asks is, what's the red line for Putin to launch a nuclear missile? How's that going to happen? So I started looking at the red lines. And as I did the research, I came upon this system called the perimeter system, which I'd never heard of. And it's like prehistoric Generation 1 artificial intelligence. And it came about because it's been there forever, since USSR. It came about because of President Reagan, the SDI initiative, Strategic Defense Initiative, the old Star Wars thing, where he said we can knock out every missile that comes into the United States. I've got this shield now. And that scared the heck out of Russia because at that time, the deterrence was mutually assured destruction, MAD. Nobody would start the war because they're both going to end up dying. So that kept everybody from firing. And the USSR said, well, if America thinks they can knock every missile out, that kind of defeats the MAD doctrine because they'll think they can launch a first strike. And they were thinking that we'll do the first strike. They're going to do a first strike on us. We're not going to be able to prevent it. So they created this perimeter system, which was known as the dead hand in NATO. And what it was a bunch of sensors all over Russia, so of all different types. So they had seismic sensors for earthquake activity, communication sensors for is the Kremlin talking to the high command, all these sensors. And if all of them triggered, if everything was met, it all fed into a computer, and the computer determined that a first strike had occurred, and then it would launch its missiles, which is why it was known as the dead hand. Nobody was in charge of the missiles. Well, that system's still in Russia. I mean, I couldn't believe it. And I was like, man, there's a story there. So I said, that's the story I'm going to write about. And once I get the plot going, then I'd like to get on the ground. I wasn't going to go get shot at in Ukraine. And I've already written about Russia in one book. I certainly wasn't going to end up in Russia. So we looked around. I said, we'll go up around the Baltic region. We ended up going to Denmark, to Sweden, Finland, and Estonia, because I like to get on the ground. I wish I could write a book like some people can just by looking at Google Earth. But there's always, I like to say there's 50% I'm looking for. I mean, I go with a list, here's what I'm looking for. And there's 50% looking for me. And I don't even know it exists, but when I get on the ground and see it, then I'll use it.
So you graduate Conroe High School here in the Houston area. You go to the University of Texas. You join the ROTC program.
Yeah.
You serve our country for 21 years in the Special Forces, becoming a lieutenant colonel. Was that your? What led you to becoming an author? Out of curiosity,
Yeah.
and how does your military experience really impact your books and your work?
Sure. I've always been a voracious reader. I had no intention of being an actual writer, as in, I'm going to make money being a writer. But I always had in the back of my head that I was going to write a novel. Just one day I was going to write a novel. And I was in a special mission unit at Fort Bragg, it's now Fort Liberty. And I took a break and I was teaching at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. And I had a lot of time on my hands. And I told my wife one day, I'm going to write a book. And she said, okay, whatever you want. And that's how I got into writing, I was just writing a story for myself. I was just going to write what I like to read. I didn't try to search out anything like that. What is a public one? I'm just like, I'm going to write my own book. And then, surprisingly enough, it sold. And so I decided to retire from the military and start writing a try. And my experiences in the military, there's nothing in any of my books that I've actually done on the ground, because a lot of it's classified. In fact, the organization itself, I didn't want anybody to say that I was writing about real world units and just changing the name and calling it fiction. So I created this I call it the task force, Project Prometheus, that's completely fiction. If anybody had ever worked in this world, they would say nobody actually does it that way. And it's a combination of fusion of intelligence assets and direct action units and things like that. We all used to kind of fantasize about it, and we all say, man, it'd be really neat if we had something like that, but we don't. Having said that, because of my experience, I knew if we did design something like that, there would be left and right limits. It wouldn't be allowed to run amok. They would have all these controls, and it's because of my experience that I was able to craft that. People ask me, are you Pike Logan? And it's like, no, I'm not Pike Logan. Usually what I say is that it's kind of like the PGA Tour. There's probably 1% of the earth that can play on the PGA Tour. There's a guy who's 100th on the money list nobody's ever heard of. Well, that's me. And there's Tiger Woods, and that's Pike Logan. Now, I'm on the PGA Tour. I mean, I did all the special operations training and everything else, but I'm not Pike Logan.
Was your first book accepted immediately? How did you sell it? You wrote it for yourself, it sounds like, but how did you actually get it published?
So I went the long-winded route of, I just started submitting it to people and seeing what they thought of it. And that, in the back of my head, I guess you kind of thought, let's see if this is going to sell. I didn't really think it ever would, but you don't win the lottery without buying a ticket, so I sent it in. And eventually an agent picked it up, and then the agent sold it to a publisher.
You lovingly call your wife Elaine, who's here, also a UT graduate, where it sounds like you guys met, the deputy commander of everything.
Yes.
Talk about her role in your experience working together, because I guess she helps you.
She absolutely helps me. So she was a media analyst for the longest time. She had her own job and her own career and everything. And I started writing 2 books a year. And so I had a lot on my plate. Especially with the new world, social media, websites, book research trips, everything we were doing, she handles all of that. She does everything except write the book. And she's also my first reader. So she reads the book. As soon as I write something, she'll read it immediately, chapter by chapter. And a lot of times it's a great help because I'm writing for the general audience. And when I get too technical on something, I read it and it reads perfectly fine to me. She'll read it and say, I don't understand what this is going on here. And so that helps me do it. But other than that, she does just about everything outside of writing the book.
So obviously, Dead Man's Hand, most recent work. What's next for you, Brad?
We actually came back from a book research trip from India. And the next book I'm working on right now is about the gray zone of warfare, short of actual bullets flying between India, China, and the United States.
Wow. Brad Taylor, native Houstonian, so grateful that you're here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for all you do. Thank you for your service to our country, too.
Thank you.
Go to barbarabushhouston.org to learn more about the Barbara Bush Houston Literacy Foundation and to explore ways you can get involved. And thank you for joining us for a celebration of reading.